Hello, everyone, and welcome back. This week we're talking about kind of the history of cultural anthropology, and less so about the development of the discipline that this person started this program at this university or whatever. But what I want to talk about is actually the history of anthropological ideas. And the concepts that we've been kicking around. And in fact, the chapter in your book is called The History of Anthropological Ideas, not the history of anthropology. And so what I'd like to do actually is to talk about how they're still contemporary, because a lot of times when you talk about the history of ideas or the history of theory, it can be really boring, first of all, and it can be kind of pointless because it's just one dead white guy after another. It's like, well, this guy said this, and then, later in the 1800s, this dead white guy said this other thing. And I don't really care about that. It's not really something that's going to have an impact on me and you and our lives. What I want to do right now is instead talk about these ideas in a contemporary setting, because some of these ideas that do go back for hundreds of years, have a big bearing on us, and they are still concepts that we're working through. They're still ideas that are around, sometimes very problematic ideas, and that's kind of what I want to focus on today. Okay. Briefly, I will also talk about how old cultural anthropology is, right? As a discipline, as I was just saying, I don't want to focus on that too much, but just to mention it some. And really, when we ask this question about cultural anthropology, what we're asking is maybe not how long we've had a discipline at the university named this, but how long have we been dealing with the concepts that cultural anthropologists like myself talk about? And so really what we're saying is we're asking a question, right? At the heart of anthropology is this question of what it is to be human. Right? What makes human beings human beings? What makes us different from other animals? What makes us different from each other? Right? And some people will claim that there's kind of some proto-anthropology out there, such as Marco Polo and other guys, Herodotus, some of these really ancient thinkers that sort of traveled and described other cultures, other ways of life, this kind of stuff. I don't always think of them as really anthropology. I guess you could argue it is a proto-anthropology, as I say here. I don't usually think of them as anthropology because at the heart of it, they weren't really scientists. They weren't trying to scientifically describe what people do. Instead, they were travel writers. They were saying, I went, in the case of Marco Polo, I went to China, or as it was called in those days, Cathay. I went to China and this is what I saw. This is some weird things they did, or this is something odd that they ate, or those kinds of things. And so I don't usually think of those as anthropological in nature because it's not a scientific inquiry. It's not trying to get at the heart of what makes people people, what makes humans humans, right? So while those guys are often mentioned, a little less important in my book, right? Really modern anthropology started in the 19th century with that rise of scientific inquiry and inquest. Anthropology arose with the natural sciences, as I think I've mentioned previously in other videos. At the time we were studying the world as we got more and more, tools at our disposal, from math to chemistry to, better equipment such as telescopes and scales and that kind of stuff. And we started doing more and more research on the natural world. And this was observational as opposed to experimental methods, right? Looking at the world around us, observing it. And in the natural sciences, we studied all of the animals, as I've said before, right? Very holistically, except for human beings, right? That we sort of divided up. And okay, you're an economist, you only study economic systems, supply and demand, all that. You're a medical doctor, so you're only going to focus on human biology and those kinds of things. Anthropology came together to say, no, we're going to study people like we study other animals holistically. We're going to look at all aspects of the life cycle, cradle to grave for human beings, right? But it also grew out of something else, specifically with cultural anthropology, which was, as I said, we started becoming more interested in what made people people. But a lot of this actually was because in the 17th century of European colonialism. As Europeans expanded around the globe, they were confronted with human beings that were very, very different from them. And to put it bluntly, they had a very racist reaction. That should not be news given the slave trade. That they asked, are these even people? Are these humans like we're humans, right? And a lot of them said no. A lot of them said, when they met Africans or Asians or indigenous Americans or those kinds of things, they said, well, they're not people like we're people. And so it started this debate among many thinkers and theorists about this idea of what is a person, right? And it led to the rise of different ideologies about how human beings came to be. And it made for some sort of interesting camps here. There were two different groups. One was called polygenesis and one was called monogenesis. Polygenicists believe that human beings, as we see them now, arose separately and weren't necessarily related. So in this camp, there were both scientists and religious scholars that sort of came together. On the scientific side, the polygenicists said, well, human beings probably evolved, but that different groups of human beings, aka at the time they said different races of human beings, evolved separately from one another. And so Europeans and white people evolved separate from that. African and black skinned people evolved separate from that. Asian people evolved separate from that. Native Americans evolved separate from that. Indigenous Australians, Aboriginals evolved, and that kind of thing. So they said that there was very different, groups here that evolutionarily were not connected to one another. On the religious side, there were those that said, clearly God made humans, but that they believed that other groups that were not sort of specifically mentioned in the Bible or Christians or things like that were either the attempt of the devil to create humans like God had, such as Africans. They literally said at the time, they were like, that's why these people have dark skin, because Satan created them in hell and it burned them. If you're looking for logic in that kind of statement, I can't help you. It's nonsense, obviously, and just racism from, the 1800s. What do you want? 1700s too. Others said it was, like the so-called Nephilim, like the offspring of like fallen angels from heaven with human women and this kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's just kind of a nutty idea. But so these camps came together to say that these different groups of human beings were not equal, were not the same, that some were inferior to others and things like that. Again, not surprising. Of course, at the top of that hierarchy of good was European peoples. It's kind of an interesting thing, too, to see how much they had to contort some of their ideologies to make that work, because quite clearly, Europe, or nowhere that is now Europe, was mentioned in the Bible. And yet somehow God created white people, but not actual Middle Eastern peoples who are mentioned in their religious scripture. So yeah, what do you want? The other group was called monogenesis, which was groups of individuals that said, no, all human beings are human beings. Everybody that you're meeting, even though they look different, we don't know why they look different, but they are still humans. And so you had some scientists that said, well, look at any animal and there's going to be variation. And humans are no different, but we're quite clearly the same thing. They quite forward thinking said, skin color is pretty superficial. They did compare humans to things like dogs. Like, these dogs are still dogs, even though you have a yellow lab and I've got a black, I don't know, pit bull or something like that. And so they said, it's pretty superficial. All humans all over the world are humans. There was also religious scholars that said, no, all people are people. God created us. No one could come close to this, even the devil. And so all people are people. That was actually the official position of the Catholic Church. To their credit, That's why they were very much against slavery, and they said, no, you have to treat indigenous people like people with humanity and kindness, and they are also children of God like you are. They didn't really follow that up much throughout their history with colonialism, but that was at least their official position. This is still an idea. Again, I want to make this about ideas that are still with us and still around. This debate is still with us a little bit. In the religious camp, less so, to be honest. I don't know of any major religion or religious tradition or sect or anything that denies that we are, in fact, all human beings at this point, and are one species, one organism, one animal. On the scientific side, it is still here a little bit. There are one or two people still in the United States that still want to claim that maybe we were evolved differently. That the evidence for that is tremendously bad, especially in the last 20 years, 25 years since we have sequenced the human genome. We can quite clearly demonstrate that we are all one thing. There's a couple of guys, to be honest with you, there's like one that I know of who is an anthropologist. He's in his 80s at this point and just won't retire. But he did his research 50 plus years ago before we barely knew what DNA was, and he wrote his dissertation arguing that, yes, actually, different races are meaningful and that they evolved from different pockets of Homo erectus, and that Homo sapien evolved in different places and at different times. Again, the evidence for that just is not there, but he's just kind of still out there pushing these theories, which we've all kind of moved past. This idea of polygenesis is actually still the official position of the Chinese government, oddly enough, that the Han Chinese think of themselves as being superior. And they argue that, again, that the Han Chinese specifically are evolved from a pocket of Homo erectus that lived in what is now China, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Again, the genetic evidence simply is not there. The archaeological evidence is not there. The linguistic evidence is not there. All of those lines of thought all point to monogenesis. All human beings are human beings. We evolved in Africa 200,000 years ago, and over the last 100,000 years have slowly spread out. And that the differences that we see in each other, as we talked about before with race, are very superficial and evolved quite recently after our various ancestors settled in various parts of the world. So the evidence is pretty clear on this, though some groups still, struggle with it. What really kind of settled the question was Darwin. When Darwin came along, it's important to note that oftentimes people will say Darwin invented evolution. Well, Darwin didn't invent evolution, nor did he even actually invent the idea of evolution. Evolution was well known in his day. His uncle had actually written a book about evolution. It was well understood what evolution was, what it was, and that it was a reality. We had the fossil record. It was limited at that time in his day, in the early 1800s. Mid 1800s, but we still had it, and we were able to look at the fossil record and say, yeah, we see clear evidence of change over time, and that's all evolution is. As I've mentioned it before, don't be put off by evolution. All evolution is change in form over time. We can see it in each other. We can see it in our skin color. We can see it in the fossil record with everything from manatees to elephants, to you name it, right? So it's quite clear that it's there. So people in his day accepted evolution. It was not even all that controversial. It was just that we didn't have the evidence for humans evolving. So a lot of people accepted evolution for all organisms but people, right? And again, this is still around a little bit. People will try to say the same thing now, that yes, evolution works, but not for humans. We were made by God or whatever, right? And that we've always been here. But when Darwin comes along, he really settled that question about polygenesis versus monogenesis in many ways. because he demonstrated that it was just evolutionary adaptation that had people looking different, but that we were all, yes, people. We were people, right? So we're asking, what does it mean to be people? It's not till the publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859 that we at least came to an agreement by and large that said, yeah, these are all people, right? And Darwin's ideas are often misinterpreted by people. Darwin, we often talk about survival of the fittest, and when we say survival of the fittest, we too often think we mean fitness in a Western sense. This idea of like, do you even lift, bro? I go to the gym. That guy is huge. He's really muscly. That's survival of the fittest. That's not what we mean by fitness. As this quote says, it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor even the most intelligent, but the ones that are most responsive to change. The ability to adapt to your environment is what he means by fitness. He means you fit into your environment well, not that you are swole, right? So that's a very different idea. But again, one that is still very much here. People still think that survival of the fittest has something to do with physical fitness or, these kinds of things. Or even, as he said here, intelligence, like survival of the fittest, like, oh, well, this person's smarter than that person, they're more fit. Well, that's got nothing to do with it. Evolution is about how well you fit into your environment, how well you are able to feed yourself, reach maturity, pass on your genes, and then have your children do that too. And so it has nothing to do with some of these ideas, but they're still very much a part of it, so to speak, right? And one of the things that is often attributed to Darwin that had nothing to do with him is social Darwinism, right? That we're trying to apply these Darwinian laws of natural selection to people. And I should mention, I said Darwin didn't invent evolution, so why does he matter? What Darwin did that is super important is that he figured out the mechanism by which evolution works, which is natural selection. Selecting for the most fit organism in that environment. Again, not the strongest, not the smartest, but the most fit to that ecological niche, right? But he did not say anything about fitness in terms of physical fitness. But Darwin is not actually responsible for social Darwinism. It really came from these other guys like Herbert Spencer and stuff that I'm going to talk about. But it, again, is really more about sociocultural things than it is biological ones, right? So it's trying to take these biological laws and apply them to the social realm. Darwin didn't have anything to do with this. The ideas for it were around before him, but it's now sort of put onto his name, and quite unfairly. But social Darwinism is a very racist, very classist, very imperialistic idea that has been around, and it was used to justify a lot when it comes to colonialism and is still with us today. Some of it came from Thomas Hobbes, quite famous in so many of the social and behavioral sciences, right? In 1651, he wrote he wrote a book, and he was talking about like sort of the natural state of man before human civilization. Forgive me, I will read this. It's a bit long-winded, but it's worth it. And so, whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own intervention shall furnish them withal. What he's saying there is might makes right. It's about survival of the fittest. It's about being a badass. It's about you who can protect yourself or not, right? In such condition, there's no place for industry. He means their sort of modern civilization and things like that, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation or use of commodities that may be imported by sea, on and on and on, right? No knowledge, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, right? The very famous quote from him is here at the end: in the life of man before, again, civilization. So, and by civilization, he means Western civilization. He means a capitalist system. He means a ruling class. He means warehouses and factories and those kinds of things. And so before all of that good European intervention that he's talking about, he said the life of man is solitary, poor, and everyone quotes this, nasty, brutish, and short. And so he's saying there that basically everyone, all of these indigenous peoples that we're meeting, their lives are crap and terrible, and therefore it's quite good that we're colonizing them. It's quite good that we're invading their country. It's quite good that we're taking over, because we're going to bring all of this good stuff, knowledge of the earth, accounts of time, arts and letters and society and navigation and all the rest of this, right? So Thomas Hobbes was a very early thinker that was justifying European colonialism. Probably the guy that's most important with this is a guy named Thomas Malthus, who wrote this essay on the principles of population. Malthus was very gloom and doom, and he is still very influential, particularly in like ecology and economics. But Thomas Malthus says that we would always sort of outbreed our food source. It was just sort of inevitable that we breed so much that we starve ourselves, that populations would always do this, even though there's no evidence that happens, right? Again, he's people talk about being very Malthusian. It means that you're very pessimistic about what people will do. The truth is, his theories haven't really held up all that much, even though he's still influential. The reality is, whenever human beings need more food, whenever they need to do things, we alter our environment, we alter substances around us, we sort of respond to it, right? And so a woman named Esther Bosrup was the big theorist that sort of corrected him much more recently, and said if you actually look at the historic record, what you see is not that humans are going to outbreed their food source constantly and starve, that populations are doomed, but rather that necessity is the mother of invention, that whenever our population starts growing, we figure out new ways to do things. So we go from hunting and gathering to farming. We go from farming to industrial farming. We create GMOs. We do all of these things and respond to it, right, through the use of fertilizer or irrigation or you name it, right, through refrigeration so that we can grow food and store it for longer, things like that. So, we're not quite what he thought, right? Probably if there is a villain in this story, it would be Herbert Spencer, right? Herbert Spencer was this theorist that was very popular in certain circles in America during the Industrial Revolution because he was very much an apologist for them. I would say that social Darwinism ought to be called social Spencerism because this was really his idea. He was before Darwin, and really kind of justified this idea that this false notion of survival of the fittest, right? That those in power deserved that power, that the poor were poor because they were weak. Again, these ideas are still around that, poverty is a defect of character, that individuals should not interbreed with others that are not of their quote unquote kind and this kind of stuff, right? During the public debate in the 1800s about things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which again is the first restrictive immigration law we ever passed in the United States, but the conversation about what was broadly called the Chinese, although it was people from many different Asian countries that were coming to America to work. And we needed them to, we wanted them to, but why they should why we as Americans should limit contact with the Chinese, especially sexually, he said that when they mix, they form a bad hybrid, right? And so very racist talk about, interracial relationships and children and stuff like that. And then why explaining colonialism is good as it clears out inferior races. He said the forces which are working out The greatest scheme of perfect happiness, taking no account of incidental suffering, exterminates such sections of mankind as stand in their way, be he human or be he brute, the hindrance must be gotten rid of. Meaning, again, that European society was obviously superior, and that Western ways of doing things were better, and that we, as we invade these countries, as we take them over, we get rid of them, and that's a plus, right? Herbert Spencer was against public schools because he said if you are so poor that you can't afford to send your kid to a private institution, then we don't even need to educate you. That is just a waste of time. You can just go to the farm and work or the factory and work, and you don't need to be educated, or you don't need to be, reading literature or books or things like that. He was against work safety standards. He said, don't touch the market, let people figure it out, those kinds of things. He was against a minimum wage. He was against child labor laws. He was very, very, today we would probably call him libertarian, right? The government should do nothing to intervene on these things. Helping people is a problem. Again, these ideas have not gone away. You still see much of this today. This idea that we have senators that still think things like the Civil Rights Act was a bad idea, right? Let things sort themselves out. Herbert Spencer was a believer that, the rich are rich because they're better, right? And again, we still have this. Poor people, we see poverty as a defect of character, rather than acknowledging that poverty is in fact something that has happened because of the way society is structured, that, you live in a poor area, your schools are inferior, you didn't have the same opportunities, you didn't have a chance to do things. College, as you guys know, can be prohibitively expensive. It is ridiculously expensive. I mean, God, how much did you guys spend this semester just on books, right? So these ideas haven't gone away. There's still a lot of folks that think these things, right? And much of this theorizing, it has made a reemergence in the last few years. So, in short, Spencer and these others were sort of arguing that might makes right, that what it is to be a human being is to be competitive, right? Competition is good. Competition is survival of the fittest. All these ideas get wrapped up that your book talks about some. And a great example of this is Might is Right, or The Survival of the Fittest by a guy named Ragnar Redbeard, which was a nom de plume. But he argued that he kind of took the logical steps of this, right? Might makes right. The fittest are those that are able to physically dominate people around them. That is the law of the jungle. And therefore, to push back against that is to push back against the natural order of things. And so if someone is stronger, it is all right that they are literally physically dominating those around them. So this guy also sort of claimed that things like spousal abuse are fine, that men beating women are fine, that because men are typically larger, this is natural, right? We see this today in the things like the incel movement and the men's rights movement, which I'll talk about in a second, that these similar ideas are leading to things like mass shootings and school shootings and stuff like that. Likewise, these ideas about sort of race mixing, or this idea that one race is superior to another, like with polygenesis, has led to more than a few people that are going around committing heinous acts of violence and murder. Dylan Roof and the church shooting, things like that. So these ideas haven't gone away, unfortunately. They're still very much with us. As I mentioned, the men's rights activism movement and the incel movement, right? Incels is a group of individuals. It's a shortened, truncated version of involuntarily celibate. This was an online group that started as sort of disaffected young men who were complaining that women wouldn't have sex with them. They were very influenced by Ragnar Redbeard and Spencer and, Malthus and social Darwinism's ideas. And they believed that they, as men, had a right to go after women and things like that. that they had a right to have sexual access to women anytime that they wanted, that basically women were not people. I mean, at the end of the day, some of this also gets wrapped up in some of these white supremacy movements that were also influenced by these ideas about race mixing and stuff like that. So this is a very fertile ground across these different groups. And a number of these guys have committed mass shootings of women or things like that. The men's rights activism movement's a little bit different. It was something that started in the 1970s as a reaction to sort of first wave and then later second wave feminism that said, oh, it's really men that have it so hard, and that men need rights and this kind of stuff. They do point out some good things. Let me say this, right? This is a documentary film called The Red Pill, which is, I cannot express how many inaccuracies there are in this film. But they point out some good things. They say, let me rephrase that. They do a good job of pointing out some problems. So, for example, men commit suicide at a much, much higher rate than women. Men are way more likely to be alcoholics. Men are way more likely to have drug addiction. Men are way more likely to be homeless than women, things like that. But rather than taking a logical conclusion and saying, well, why is this? What is it about the way that we have raised men in our society that's leading to this? They instead say this is because of women or feminism or, these kinds of things, or it shows that men have it so bad in our culture. And so it becomes a very anti-feminism movement. It becomes a very anti-woman movement. That women are the root of sort of men's problems, rather than recognizing that, these cultural ideas about gender, about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, is leading to many of these problems. So, for example, the idea that men cannot express their feelings. And again, how does this relate to our original question of what makes humans humans? It gets into these ideas that culture it is what's driving many of these issues. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? Is underneath that question of what is it to be a human being. But with the men's rights activism movement, they fail to acknowledge the fact that, like, culturally we raise men to believe you cannot express feelings, that you are weak or inferior, or like a woman if you express anything. And so because of that, with no outlet, with no healthy outlet for emotional expression, men turn to things like drugs and alcohol and suicide, and you can't ask for help and this kind of stuff, So again, all of this kind of gets wrapped up in there, right? So as I said, Darwinian evolution sort of settled the debate, at least genetically speaking, right, about human populations being one and the same. And therefore we sort of turned to talking about culture and cultural evolution. We realized that what separates us is not biology, it's culture, it's learned behavior, right? And so more and more theorists started talking about this idea of maybe taking evolution from a biological sense and applying it to culture. And so you see early guys like Lewis Henry Morgan and others coming up with what is called unilineal social evolution, which is the idea that people will pass through stages. It still applies some of these fairly racist ideas that justified colonialism and stuff like that, that people would go from savagery to barbarism to civilization, meaning that there is still a better culture. Not surprisingly, they said it was European. There is still a better culture, and there's an inferior culture. Not that these other people are people in their own right, but they're just failed versions of us, that they have not gotten here yet. They haven't evolved culturally yet, and so they're certainly inferior to us. As I said, this is unilineal evolution. It was very popular with these early thinkers who saw us going through stages of quote unquote progress. And this is why anthropologists tend to be very, very suspicious of progress, as we say, because it is something that ultimately ranks people and ultimately says, well, you need to have some kind of progress You need to get better at these things. Again, going back to these early thinkers that said, we're doing them a favor by invading their country and changing their culture and this kind of stuff. Again, an idea that is still very much around and used to justify military interventions around the globe to this day, of saying, we can fix you, right? You're broken because you don't vote like we vote. You don't have industry like we have industry. You don't have family systems like we have family systems. You don't have a religion like we have, and therefore it's okay that we're coming in and doing this because we're helping you, right? Much later on in the 20th century, we come to understand this idea of multilineal cultural evolution, that different regions are going to produce different cultural forms based on values and ideas and beliefs and the resources that they have there and the population that they have there and all of these kinds of things, right? One of these early guys, though, that talked about culture, the topic of our approach here, was E.B. Tyler. And he really had the first universal definition of culture. Prior to him, it was a conversation that what is culture was usually what is European, right? Culture means that you have opera and literature and ballet and this kind of stuff. And he said, no, culture is something that everybody has, even if they don't have literature, and so he argued that there was this learned behavior, this mechanism for our adaptation, was something that we all possess. He was kind of the first true anthropologist. He did do some limited field work, not a lot, but he actually worked in Oaxaca, Mexico, where I did my master's research. And so he was out there a little bit. One of the ideas that he kind of came up with that is still around is what we call survivals. And a survival, according to him, was something that at one time served a function in a culture, but no longer does. And so he said it's just kind of a holdover, and it's sort of around. A couple of quick examples I can give you is a necktie, right? Why do we wear neckties? As a man and looking professional, I always wear a tie. Neckties actually are a good example of this. Centuries ago, when we were still engaged in sort of direct physical combat, right? Centuries back when you had knights and squires and, cavalry and stuff like that, men wore plate armor when they were going into battle. But obviously you can't wear something like around your neck. You have to be able to turn your head and look and stuff. And so they would often wrap like a thick piece of leather around their neck that would then hang down into their breastplate of plate armor. When they took their heavy armor off, it became kind of a symbol that a man would still wear this sort of leather thing. And even if you didn't see him on the battlefield, even if you didn't see him in his armor, it sort of told you I'm a knight, which means that I'm, rich, because only rich people were knights, it means that I'm rich. It means that I'm a warrior. It means that I'm tough. It means all of these kinds of things. In time, when we stopped engaging in direct physical combat, though, that symbol sort of stuck around, right? And so men stopped making it out of like really heavy, thick, smelly ass leather, and they started making it out of silk or cotton or these kinds of things. And it still became a sign of virility and badassery and manliness and all of this kind of stuff. That's why typically men wear neckties, and it is not particularly typical for women to wear a necktie, right? And so this doesn't serve a function anymore. It just lays here on my shirt and it doesn't do anything, but it's a survival from this bygone era. Another fun example is the QWERTY keyboard. The QWERTY keyboard is the keyboard that you see probably in front of you right now that is typical on a computer. Obviously, this is from a typewriter, right? It's called the QWERTY keyboard. If you see at the very top, it actually spells QWERTY, right? The thing about the QWERTY keyboard is when typewriters were invented, we had a problem, and that is that they were extremely delicate machines. They were extremely expensive machines. And when people were typing, they could type so fast that if you guys remember, seeing a keyboard or a typewriter at your grandma's house or something, I doubt any of you own one, but the arms would swing up and type the letters as you were going along. The problem is people would type so fast that the arms would swing up and hit each other and they would damage each other. And so they designed a keyboard where the letters were all jumbled up, so that it would slow you down for typing, right? Because when at first they were just A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you know those letters. If I ask you what letters are on either side of B, you know it's A and C, right? That's the alphabet. But on a keyboard, if I ask you what letters are next to B, without looking, I find that students don't know, even though you know the keyboard well. But you're like, what letters? Oh, it's V and N. Even I had to glance down, right? And so it was designed to slow us down, right? Well, that's not really a problem anymore with laptops, right? But it's a holdover. It's a survival. Like, we've always made keyboards this way. I guess we'll just keep making them this way, right? But this is another idea here that's still with us, because Tyler said religion was a survival. He said at one time religion served a function. It explained where the sun went at night and where hurricanes come from, and things like that. And he said, but we don't need it anymore because now we have science to explain all of those things, right? I disagree with him. I think religion serves a lot more of a function than what he gave it credit for in terms of hope, in terms of community. There are still questions, as I've mentioned before, that science can't answer. What happens when you die? Why does that person get cancer and that person doesn't? Why does a hurricane blow down that house but not this one? Randomness, I guess you might say. So religion still does serve a function that science can't, but that idea is still around. If you've seen the movie Religulous with Bill Maher, he is a noted atheist, and he basically spent an entire documentary kind of being an ass and crapping all over religion. But that's basically his argument in there too, is that at one time we needed religion to explain the world, but we don't anymore because we have chemistry and astronomy and geology and that kind of stuff. So again, this is and other noted sort of atheists have also still used Tyler's ideas of survivals. So it's still with us, right? Another guy that I want to talk about really quickly that I think I've mentioned before is Bronislaw Malinowski. I think we talked about him when we were talking about economics and reciprocity and this kind of stuff. Again, talking about the history of the discipline here. Really important guy, because he is why we do participant observation. He is why we spend long periods of time living with the people that we are studying, because he realized that it was a necessary thing for us to really get at what a culture is and this kind of stuff. I know we talked about reciprocity before, so I won't again, but when he was studying the Kula Ring and coming to understand how sort of the trading of things among people is not about the economic value of them oftentimes, but about the social relations that are built with them. And that is something that we still study to this day. Franz Boas, I want to mention really briefly because he is sort of a central figure in anthropology, kind of the founder of American anthropology, started the first PhD program at Columbia University, trained the first generation of anthropologists. And he's very important because actually he is why so much of what we talk about, it's still things that we talk about, and it's still conversations that are going on. Boas and his students were really the first scientists that were extremely critical of the race theory, this idea of different human races being significant from our earliest days. I mean, he was publishing books and articles about how race was nonsense. His students were publishing books and articles about how gender is a cultural construct and it's not something that is biological. Again, I'm sure you guys have noticed that these are still arguments that are out there trying to demonstrate that different races are not radically different from one another, that genders are something that are a product of society and things like that. To this day, unfortunately, if you look at books like The Bell Curve, New York Times bestseller, that are trying to say that different races have different IQs. Well, first of all, IQ scoring is utter and complete nonsense. It's just ridiculous. If you look at the history of it, you'll realize how pointless this number is. It means nothing. It doesn't measure anything. But it's still an idea that's around, and it's an idea that has been co-opted and used by racists, white nationalists, and white supremacists for many, many years now to justify that, we need to protect the white race or things like that because we're going to degrade our genes and this kind of nonsense, right? Guys like Richard Spencer recently or Jared Taylor and their calls for ethno-state are behind this, right? So this hasn't gone away, unfortunately, and even though we've been writing about it for more than a century now. That the races are equal, that skin color is pretty meaningless, all of that we discussed before. One of the things about Boas that was important too is that talking about this sort of cultural evolution was that he talked about environmental possibilism as opposed to environmental determinism. You know, before Boas, we thought the environment just determines culture, right? What Boas realized was that it really sets limits, but it creates potential, and that cultures evolve and adapt to the environment just as human beings evolve and adapt to their environment. That kind of environmental determinist talk is still around, that the environment will determine what people do, what their culture looks like, what their economic system is going to look like. Jared Diamond, who is actually an ornithologist, he studies birds, not people, wrote a book about, as he said, the fates of human societies, right? Called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Some of you might have read it. It was a New York Times bestseller. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It's a hugely influential book. I enjoyed the book a great deal, but there is some problems with it in the sense that he is not really respectful to nor receptive of the idea that human societies can adapt in different ways, but rather just that the environment is determining what they look like. And he also is not explicitly, because he's, I don't think that he thinks this at all, but that his book ultimately becomes kind of an apology for European society. And it ultimately looks at these things, and while he doesn't explicitly say it, many other people have come along and used his work to say that the ultimate goal of human societies is to become like European ones, right? With this, you know, market capitalism, social and political hierarchy, and these kinds of things, without respecting that there are many people that never did that, and they don't want to do that. They don't want to become little versions of us, right? But that he's saying, yeah, Europeans lucked out. He makes a really good argument that Europeans were quite lucky in their environment, as I've discussed before elsewhere. But that he fails to acknowledge that what many people feel is that, yeah, they lucked out and had all of these benefits, but that doesn't make them better. That just makes them different, right? He is still arguing for kind of a unilineal evolution of just, well, yeah, the Aboriginal Australians didn't do this because they weren't in the environment for it. Yeah, but that doesn't mean that they want to be or needed to be or should have been, right? Too much of this becomes still this idea of progress and that we should be little Europeans. Today we talk about human ecology, really, with this. We're talking about human biological ecology, which is adaptation to biological means, as opposed to cultural ecology, where we are looking at adaptation through culture, right? But our relationship with the environment has become a big Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead was a student of Franz Boas and was and continues to be a very influential thinker. She was an anthropologist that worked excuse me, in the Pacific Islands, and she talked a lot about personality and sex roles, gender, childhood development. Her theories and ideas have remained influential to us. She actually won like a presidential award. She had a postage stamp made in her likeness and things like that. I mean, really, really influential in so many ways. And probably one of the biggest things is talking about gender and sex, right? If you follow it, all the conversations that we're having about the rights for trans people and things like that today, the role of men and women, this kind of stuff. She wrote extensively on this, right? She actually lived with different peoples and found that there wasn't this idea of like men have to be this way or women have to be this way, right? Among one group, she found that, Both men and women were peaceful in temperament and nobody made war. In another group she found, and these were three groups that all lived in the same region. So there couldn't be an argument that this is like environmentally determined, right? Or genetic in nature, right? She said that among this other group, the opposite was true. Both men and women were warlike in temperament. And among this third group, they were totally different. That the men spent all of their time sort of primping and like getting dressed up and decorating themselves and doing makeup and stuff, whereas the women were the ones that were sort of no nonsense and serious and practical and worked hard and all of this. And again, she was doing this work in the 1920s, 1930s. It was really the opposite of what we were seeing in the early 20th century in America. And so she really challenged these ideas that gender is something that is built into us. And this is why we say like sex is biological, gender is cultural. And so unfortunately, we're still trying to explain this to people when they say, no, boys can't wear, lipstick or nail polish or something like that, and women shouldn't be working or doing this or doing that. They're more inclined to do this other thing, and they're nurturers, and they're oh, that's just nonsense. It is how we raise people. It is the culture. It is learned behavior. And as I said, this is still around. This is a book that was written several years ago, 10 books that screwed up the world. And it's supposed to be, just the worst things that ever happened, and books and ideas that were just dangerous and screwed everything up. The guy that wrote this included, Hitler's Mein Kampf and things like that. But he also included Margaret Mead's work, and it claims that from another anthropologist named Derek Freeman, who quite falsely claimed that Mead maybe made up some of her research and stuff like that. She was working in the 1920s, 1930s. There are parts of her work that today we're like, you kind of overreached there. I don't know if I draw the same conclusion. We have a different approach, different ways of thinking about things, different techniques for data collection. But that by and large, her work does stand the test of time. And her conclusions were, broadly correct. About human culture and human society and things like that. But yeah, this guy, included Margaret Mead's work in there along with Hitler, and so it's still a controversial idea that people seem to have a hard time accepting that, in fact, gender's a thing we made up, right? So getting back to our original question, right? Why are people different from one another, right? Culture more than biology, we've come to understand. But that then begs the question, why are cultures different, right? We explored the idea that it is environmental, that the environment's going to determine it. That became very problematic, that people living in the same environment with one another can turn out very, very differently, like Margaret Mead found with the differences of culture in terms of gender roles and things like that. So this gets into some theoretical debates, right? And I know whenever you say theory, people are like, oh God, no, not theory. It's so abstract. It's so boring. It doesn't have to be, right? Theory is just a tool. Theory is a tool that you use to explain something. Why do human beings do this or that? Theory is there to help us with that. And as Barbara Miller, a wonderful anthropologist, wrote once, that theory and anthropology, quote, goes to the heart of its basic questions about how people behave and think cross-culturally and why people think and behave the way that they do. So in other words, it's our question, right? What makes people people? What makes human beings human beings? And then what makes human beings different from other human beings, right? So it gets at that thing. Two of the big theoretical ideas that are around with us today that I wanted to mention are cultural materialism and interpretive anthropology. Cultural materialism is the idea that the material aspects of life, right, the environment, population size, tools, technology, this kind of stuff, is going to shape what cultures look like. Okay, so this was started by a guy named Marvin Harris, who I've probably mentioned before. Harris was quite famous for talking about Hindu cows, and I may have talked about this before briefly, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. What he said was, when you look at, why don't Hindus eat cows, right? Why in Hinduism is it taboo to eat a cow? Well, to Hindus, it is because cows are sacred. But again, he's a cultural materialist. So he says, I believe that all behavior can be explained through what he called infrastructure, right? Not ideas, not ideology, not beliefs, but the material aspects of life. And so he said, quite accurately, that the truth is, if you look at it, living cows are worth more than dead cows, because if you kill a cow, you can eat it, and you eat really well, but not for very long, especially in the ancient world when we didn't have refrigeration. Especially in the ancient world in somewhere like India, where you're talking about the tropics and meat is going to spoil very, very quickly there, things like that. He said, but if you keep your cow alive, you can plow your fields, you can get milk, you can make butter. And he said it makes sense because we are not competing with cows. Cows eat things that we can't eat. So me and a cow can live on the same piece of land. That cow's going to eat grass. I can't eat that. It's going to eat hay. I can't eat that, right? And so it can eat the things that I can't, right? And so it makes sense to say, no, you don't kill your cows, because you're going to eat well in the short term. But he also did research and found that without cows to pull, or oxen or things like that, to pull a plow, then you really can't get your fields planted in it quickly enough during a narrow growing season, right? That you're going to starve long term if you're trying to plow it by yourself with just hand tools. And so you need to keep this thing alive to keep yourself fed long term. It's long term thinking, not short term, because of all of these material aspects of stuff. Likewise, then the prohibition on pigs among both Jews and Muslims kind of makes sense, right? Again, for Jews and Muslims, the prohibition is because God said so, right? It's ideology. But he says, no, it's about infrastructure. He said, if you look at Judaism and Islam, they, arise in very similar areas in the world, in the Middle East, which is a very arid region, a lot of desert there. It is a very difficult place to make a living in many ways. Not totally, again, I'm lumping one huge region altogether here. But there's very little water and those kinds of things. And so it can be difficult to make a living there, so to speak. In terms of growing your food in the ancient world. And so he said it makes sense to ban pigs because pigs eat what you and I eat. Unlike cows, they are direct competitors to us. So pigs can eat about anything, but it's actually not good for them, and the meat's terrible and stuff. For a pig to be healthy and for pork to be good, they need to eat what we're eating. So they need fruits and vegetables and nuts and tubers and berries and, all of that kind of stuff. Well, in a really arid environment, it does not make sense, because you have to grow that food and then feed that food to a pig, and you are losing calories in that process. If you're going to grow, fruits and vegetables, just eat them, right? Rather than feeding them to pigs and eating the pigs, you will get more calories by just eating that stuff. And so in a really arid environment without a lot of water, for farmers, it made sense to say pigs are taboo. You can't touch pigs. Don't eat pigs, because it is a better adaptation to that environment, right? Another kind of strong school of thought is interpretive anthropology, which is kind of the opposite of cultural materialism in many ways. Instead of saying it's about infrastructure, environment, population, tools, technology, all of that kind of stuff, he said, this school of thought, which was put forward by Clifford Geertz, focused on what Harris called superstructure, right, which is ideas, values, beliefs, right. And so the thought here was that it was you can't just look at the material; you have to understand all the nuance of it. And I think I mentioned this before. The wink, Geertz said, look at winking. Why do we wink, and what does a wink mean? You really need to look at it from an ideas perspective, a belief structure of what people are trying to do. So he said, one person might wink because they actually have, like, say, a nervous tic, and so their eye just winks. but another person might wink in a conspiratorial way that, I'm winking to let you know that, like, perhaps what I just said isn't true, like that I'm lying. Other people might wink as a sign of affection, right? You look over at your girlfriend or boyfriend on the couch while you're watching a movie and you give them a little wink, it's a display of affection, this kind of stuff that he said, if you really want to get at human behavior, you've got to dig a little bit deeper, right? Um, he wrote a very famous article called Notes on a Balinese Cockfight, which is about chicken fighting. We won't get into it today. But nonetheless, I also want to point out neither one of these is right or wrong exclusively. Both of them are used to describe things, and in certain situations, one works better than the other, but that doesn't mean that the other school of thought is wrong, right? It depends on what we want to talk about. So as I said at the beginning, theory isn't scary. Theory is just a tool. And just like tools, some tools are better at some jobs, right? A hammer is wonderful. It's a great tool if you need to drive a nail. It's terrible if you need to cut a 2x4 in half, right? So if you're trying to explain why people do things when it comes to the environment, materials, making a living, stuff like that, cultural materialism is great. Conversely, if you're trying to look at something that is a little bit more nuanced, interpretive anthropology is going to be probably a better school of thought, right? And this gets into the idea also of like structure and agency, right? Structure and agency, again, I want to say, ideas that are still very much with us, conversations that we're still having. Structure in society is the idea that there is a limiting factor. It is what is beyond the control of the individual, right? So, for example, Philippe Bourgois, very famous anthropologist, wrote this book, In Search of Respect, Selling Crack in El Barrio. He did research in Spanish Harlem in the 1980s, with 70s and 80s, mostly the 80s, with crack dealers, right? And he pointed out that despite this cultural stereotype that drug dealers are like sort of evil, sinister Hollywood bad guys that are trying to do awful things on purpose, he said, actually, these guys are crack dealers because they don't have any other option. They grew up in a really poor area. The schools there are crap. There is no money, so that means that there's not really any businesses around there because nobody's there to support them. Since there's no businesses, there's no jobs. Because the place is poor and had, that kind of stuff, a lot of people turn to crime, whether it be theft or robbery or drug dealing. He said because of that, the city stopped running buses there, so they can't even take a bus to, another part of town and get a job and things like that. So it's the structure of society, this limiting factor that beyond their control has put them in a position where the only viable job for them is drug dealer, right? And he said when he was working with them, he was a university student at NYU. I think it was NYU. And he said all these drug dealers that were supposed to be, lazy people that were dealing drugs for huge money, they would constantly ask him like, hey, man, is there like a fast food place on campus? Do you know anybody? Could you get me a job there? Because the truth is they'd actually make more money with a minimum wage job than they did selling crack. A lot of people don't realize this, but it's like crack dealers, they get arrested and they might have $3,000 or $4,000 in their pocket. But they have to give that back to the guy that they're getting the crack from. That's not their money, right? They're making less than minimum wage. And so that's the kind of, structure. Other examples of this that I always point out is, well, I'll come to that. Let me explain agency. Agency is the limitless factor. It's that which you can control. It's that which you push back against structure on, right? It's about your ability to do something, right? Good examples of these are things like tourism studies. What we find is that in areas where you see more and more tourism, people might be quite poor, but they're able to sort of say, okay, well, I have all these tourists coming here. What can I do? Can I make tamales and sell them over there by the archaeological ruin that all these gringos go to? Or can I, walk along the beach in Cancun and sell, I don't know, necklaces to, gringos or whatever. So all of this is sort of tied into each other. Now, one of the things that I want to say is that structure and agency are two sides of the same coin. They're both working for you and against you in a certain way, right? the reality is that both are happening. So this is something that is still with us, that we know that structure and agency happen at the same time. What I was going to say a minute ago was I was pointing out Dr. King is a great example of this, right? Dr. King was this amazing man, really brilliant, but in his day and time, it's not like he could have become a senator, right, or president. The structure of society was such that even though he was brilliant, he was inspiring, he was highly intelligent, he was highly motivated, he was still limited by things, right? He couldn't be a county judge. He couldn't be, so many of these things, a police chief in the South or something like that. But he also had agency, and he pushed against that. He didn't just say, well, this is all I got, right? And so he kind of pushed against it and said, I'm going to do more, as I said, we are all both of these things, right? And so structure and agency comes into play when we try to answer many basic questions about how society works. So, for example, why are poor people poor, right? Now, before you say, well, they don't have any money, I mean a little deeper than that, right? What causes poverty, right? Well, it's both, right? If I ask you this, and in the classroom, I often ask students, why are poor people poor? And people say, well, they live in a poor area. There aren't a lot of jobs. The schools aren't good. They don't have the money for a car. And if you don't have reliable transportation, it's hard to get a job. They don't have the resources, the cash to buy professional clothes or things like that, But also, that's the structure side. But on the agency side, you also see things like, poor people do spend more of their money on things like alcohol or cigarettes, or sort of non-essential goods, like they spend a higher percentage of their income on like cable or a flat screen TV or things like that. And so it is both the things that the individual cannot control that causes poverty, but it is also the things that the individual can control. Both are a part of this. Now, which one is more, right? That honestly is a good example of how this enters into our current political structures, right? Our current political ideologies. Typically speaking, and I'm using broad strokes here, what you find is that people that are more progressive tend to focus on the structure, and that people that are more conservative tend to focus on the agency. They say poor people are poor, because of the things that they can't control, and so we need to change those things. Or poor people are poor because they're making bad decisions, and we can't change that. That's on them, right? And so this idea of structure and agency is something that very much is still around. And the last thing that I want to talk about when we're discussing theory today is postmodernism in anthropology. Postmodernism is a term that is used, and it really means different things in different disciplines, and it gets really complicated, and we don't have time to dig into all of it, but I want to talk about it really briefly. Postmodernism in anthropology is a school of thought that is very critical, very reactionary, that came along to make us question the claims that we're making, to say, you're going to claim that Hindus don't eat cows for this reason, or you're going to claim that Muslims don't eat pork for this reason, or whatever. Like, how do you really know that? That is something that you are coming up with. That is not something that is an absolute objective fact. It is ultimately in your interpretation of the data. And so in that way, it did offer a good criticism for us, right, in anthropology, to say that these ideas that you are a human, you're fallible, this is your idea, right? And so don't necessarily say, well, Mexican culture is like this, and therefore that's a gospel fact, right? Unfortunately, though, so that was good. Unfortunately, postmodernism often got carried away and took to a very nihilistic end and became very anti-science in many ways, because they said, well, if these ideas are just interpretations, right, then all ideas are interpretations, and therefore all things are just opinion, and therefore there is no facts, right? So it became very anti-science, and while it served this valid reminder to us to be careful about our own assumptions and biases and things, it ultimately became very anti-science and I'll say very unproductive, right? There is a knowable universe, right? As I say, otherwise, why bother studying anything, right? We are able to measure things. We are able to establish facts. Sometimes those facts will need interpretation, sometimes not, but we can use the best tools at our disposal to interpret those facts, right? There was a very famous case of Alan Sokal, who was a scientist that wrote this postmodernist article for a journal called The Social Text. And he wrote nonsense. He just strung huge 12-letter words together that read, but they don't mean anything. I mean, they mean absolutely nothing. And they published this thing in a peer-reviewed journal. And afterwards, he wrote a piece criticizing them and said, I sent you an article of gibberish, and your school of thought is so full of BS that you guys didn't even notice that it doesn't mean anything, right? It's all crap, right? So postmodernism is a good reminder for us to pace ourselves, so to speak, but it also is there to say, listen, it's there to say, listen, you guys think about your own biases on these assumptions and stuff, but it ultimately isn't super productive because of this, right? So that's pretty much what I have talking about this. Your book goes into more detail and depth on this, but as I said, I want you to understand as we talk about these ideas that we're not talking about, some theory that died, some school of thought that died a long time ago. These ideas are still with us. These ideas about what makes people people. Does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a man or a woman? What does it mean to be in a nation state? All of this kind of stuff. We're still working on these ideas. We're still working on these theories. We've had a lot of productive stuff, but unfortunately, that's not always well disseminated. But this stuff is still out there and still has a bearing on our lives today. Right? Thank you guys so much.